Hey everybody, today I'm gonna talk about the Shrek series. You know, there's something about just saying that sentence that puts a smile on my face. I just love thinking about Shrek and knowing that Shrek exists. And what's more, I do think there's an unexpected amount of thematic stuff going on under the surface of these films, and that they come together to say something interesting. One might say, and I'm not saying this, but one might say that the Shrek movies are like onions, in that they have a bunch of neat layers to them. So anyway, that's this video. Get ready to hear some hot takes about Shrek. More than anything else, the first Shrek is a very simple movie that wants to express a very simple idea. At the beginning, Shrek is a guy who society regards as an outcast. He's seen as ugly and unworthy of love.
People take one look at me and go, "Ah, help, run! A big, stupid, ugly ogre." They judge me before they even know me.
But in the end, after Shrek has made a friend and fallen in love with Princess Fiona, the film culminates with the idea that Shrek is worthy of love and acceptance, and that he always was. Shrek doesn't need to physically transform for Fiona to love him, and he doesn't need to change a lot about his personality either. Rather, the only thing Shrek has to accept is that he is the sort of thing that can be happy and live authentically. To put it simply, he attains self-love and self-actualization in a society that problematizes his identity. That's what Shrek is about, right? It was obvious to me when I saw the movie when I was 5, and it's obvious to me now. The film says what it wants to say, and I'm not here to challenge that. Instead, I'm interested in looking at how this movie behaves, the assumptions and themes that it expresses under the surface, and how those themes play with the rest of the movies in the franchise. So let's talk about that stuff. To start off, this movie is really interested in the process through which identities and behaviors become deviant or unacceptable. And the way Shrek treats this idea is probably the most unique thing about it.
You are deformed.
I am deformed.
And you are ugly.
And I am ugly.
See, people who watch a lot of kids' movies, like me, are very used to seeing characters in marginal positions. Look at the Beast, or at Aladdin, or at Quasimodo. These are people who the world has turned its back on, who live on the outskirts in one way or another.
Why invite their calumny and consternation? Stay in here.
But in all of these cases, the relationship between society and our character is as simple as, get out, we don't like you. The town Belle comes from hates the Beast. Once they find out he exists, they immediately understand him as a disease that needs to be eradicated.
Good and dead! Kill the beast! No.
The same holds true for Aladdin and Quasimodo. The world they live in constantly tries to push them out or pretend like they don't exist. But what's kinda cool is that Power in Shrek doesn't just say, get out, we don't like you, to the various characters in the film. Instead, it says, come in. You are a subject in this society. Your purpose is to be deviant. Let me show you what I mean by that. At the very beginning of the movie, Shrek is an outcast who everybody hates. But this isn't actually posed as much of a problem.
Back, beast! Back! I warn ya!
Shrek enjoys life on the margin, gets off on not being a part of normal society. No, the real conflict starts when Shrek and his swamp are interpreted by Lord Farquaad as part of his kingdom.
Your swamp? Yeah, my swamp, where you dumped those fairy-tale creatures.
Indeed. All right, Ogre, I'll make you a deal. Go on this quest for me, and I'll give you your swamp back.
Suddenly, in this scene, the space Shrek inhabits is included in the state of Duloc. It becomes property, something that the government can have claim to. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like Farquaad actively wants to make Shrek a member of Duloc Kingdom or anything like that. After all, the whole reason he takes the swamp is so he can make a ghetto for fairy tale creatures. Still though, the movie implies something really interesting here. that for Shrek to become a deviant, for his land to become a place for deviants, they must both be thrust into society and understood as things that can be used by that society.
Now hand it over.
Very well, Ogre. The deed to your swamp cleared out as agreed. Take it and go.
And we can see this idea popping up with the other main characters in the film. Like, look at the scene where Donkey is introduced. An old woman presents him to an agent of the law who's buying up fairy tale creatures so that they can be imprisoned.
Well, I've got a talking donkey.
But before the sale can go through, Donkey has to talk. He has to prove that he has an identity.
Right. Well, that's good for 10 shillings, if you can prove it.
Like Shrek, the moment Donkey becomes an outsider to the state is also necessarily the moment where he becomes a member of that state. For power to render Donkey as a non-person, this guy first has to agree that he is a person.
Hey, I can fly.
He can fly!
He can fly. He can talk.
When we look at these two characters, the protagonist and his sidekick, we can see that they suggest that deviance is more complicated than society pushing some people away. Rather, the film understands the construction of deviance as a balancing act, one that brings people inside of society in the same breath it uses to push them away. But ultimately, Shrek doesn't, culminate in this idea, right? It's not a movie about a bunch of people realizing how oppression works. I mean, let's look at Fiona for a second. On one level, we can see her character as a total embodiment of everything I just said. Pretty human during the day, ogre at night, her identity is itself a negotiation between being acceptable and being unacceptable. She's pushed into society as a princess, and she's pushed out as a monster. But in the end, none of that complexity matters much, because she and Shrek realize, who cares how society constructs or forms her identity? There is a way out of all this badness, and it's called love. Within the first movie, power and the state are the things over there that make you sad. And our characters, the people without power, can only be happy and live authentically by kind of forgetting about society. So it's time we turn our attention to the second Shrek movie. In a lot of ways, I think it picks up thematically where the first film left off. Shrek 2, a movie centering on Shrek and Fiona visiting the kingdom of Far, Far Away and dealing with Fiona's dad, is, on the face of it, more thematically fresh than the first film was. I mean, we can talk all we want about how strangely the state works in the original, but at the end of the day, the movie tells a story we've seen a bunch of times. The characters who have power oppress the characters who don't, but then the characters who don't have power end up beating the characters who do. It's a classic, fun tale. But if Shrek 1 wants to tell the story of powerless people in a society that rejects them, then Shrek 2 wants to ask, what's it like for the people who are powerful? What does the state do to the people who control the state? So at the beginning of the film, Shrek's role in life is immediately changed. After he marries Fiona, Shrek goes from being a random ogre who owns a swamp to being a prince, the son-in-law of the king. And in theory, that shift could put an end to Shrek feeling like an undesirable outsider. But of course it doesn't. Shrek is detested by the king, and he feels totally out of place in this position.
This is Fiona's choice.
Yes, but she was supposed to choose the prince we picked out for her. I mean, you expect me to give my blessings to this thing?
And here, we come to the theme that Shrek 2 really wants us to think about. That having power or influence doesn't exempt you from being a deviant. In fact, the opposite is kinda true. The same forces that pushed characters into and out of the state in the first movie are only magnified in the second. King Harold, Fiona's father, is the most important example of this. He is the absolute ruler of Far, Far Away, and so we might expect him to be a figure who can't be an outsider. He is the state, after all. He's supposed to decide who is included or excluded from that state. But that's not how things work in this movie. Even though Harold is the king, he's still subject to a higher and more abstract law. that of social norms and expectations. See, we learn toward the end of the movie that Harold is a frog.
Shrek, Fiona, will you accept an old frog's apologies?
The only reason he looks human is that he made a deal with the fairy godmother, giving Fiona away in marriage to Prince Charming.
You see, we made a deal, Harold. And I assume you don't want me to go back on my part.
Indeed not.
So Fiona and Charming will be together.
And considering that for much of the movie, our king is subservient to another entity, the godmother, we're forced to come to an unexpected conclusion. Within Shrek 2's logic, power is not owned by the king. Rather, power acts through him. His sovereignty over Far, Far Away is only absolute so long as he's acceptable. And for him to be acceptable, he has to conform. And when we look at Shrek 2 with this conclusion in mind, it kind of makes sense of just how over-the-top ridiculous and wonderful this movie is. Like, the whole thing is brimming with people trying to change themselves and trying to negotiate with complicated power structures. First off, of course, we have King Harold, who's so desperate to maintain his human facade that he locks his daughter in a tower so Prince Charming can rescue and marry her. Then, when it turned out Shrek saved Fiona, the king puts a literal hit out on him to make the fairy godmother happy. In response to finding out that his father-in-law wants him dead, Shrek doesn't, get angry or anything. No, he thinks, how can I change and be the normal person that Fiona and society need me to be?
Maybe Fiona would have been better off if I were some sort of Prince Charming.
He goes off and steals a potion from the godmother to make himself handsome. But this act, which seems to go against what the godmother wants, gets folded back into her power play. She has Prince Charming pretend to be the handsome Shrek so he can kiss Fiona and make her fall in love with him.
What happened to your voice?
The potion changed a lot of things, Fiona. But not the way I feel about you.
It's almost overwhelming how much is going on here, and it all seems to center on one main idea. That every main actor in the film, Charming, Shrek, and the King, has to distort themselves and their identities. To have power, or be acceptable to power, they have to understand who they are as deviants who must be changed in some way. Well, that's not entirely true, is it? Like Shrek 1, the sequel ends with the idea that its characters can live authentically and accept themselves. Shrek ends up being happy as an ogre, and King Harold ends up okay as a frog. Power might be distorting, but we can work around it and find our true selves if we try hard enough and love each other. The ending is optimistic, and I think this might be the last truly optimistic ending in the Shrek series. With that sort of ominous statement, enter Shrek the Third. It's no secret that this movie represents a drop in quality for the Shrek franchise. I mean, the jokes aren't funny anymore, right? Enough said.
This is a costume? I worked on it all night long!
But as not so great as this movie is, I do think it says something kinda cool to the other two films we've talked about. In fact, I would say it represents an incredibly important thematic turning point in the series. In one of the first scenes in the movie, King Harold, on his deathbed, tells Shrek that he's next in line for the throne. If Shrek wants to avoid being king, he has to find his replacement, King Arthur.
Aside from you, there is only one remaining heir.
So he goes and does that. And just looking at the premise of this movie, I feel like there's been a tone shift in the Shrekiverse. Regardless of what you see in Shrek 1 and 2, I think there's one pretty uncontroversial statement we can make about them. They pose Shrek against power, and against the way that society tends to work. Either he's on the outside and is seen as an outcast, or he's on the inside, sort of, and is seen as an outcast. In Shrek the Third, though, Shrek is now just a weird cog in the power machine. King Harold tells him, you gotta be king or you gotta go find Arthur, and Shrek is like, yes sir, right away sir, I'm gonna go continue the legacy of a man who incarcerated his daughter and tried to kill me. Very strange. But what's more striking to me than the fact that Shrek goes on this weird journey is that he doesn't seem to think there's another option. From his perspective, he has a choice between being power or being power's errand boy. He could easily say no to Harold, and it would cost him nothing. But he doesn't do that. It doesn't even cross his mind to do so. And I think this moment tells us something about what this Shrek movie is doing with the ideas laid out in the first two films. Power is no longer foreign to Shrek. No longer a strange force that has to be struggled against and negotiated with. No. He's been in the kingdom long enough to think of power as normal and necessary, to look at the status quo and think, how can we maintain this? And what's kinda odd is that this new idea, that power is normal and good, is accompanied by a general sense of meaninglessness. There's a whole bunch of loose threads in this movie that I have no idea what to do with. Donkey and Puss in Boots switch bodies.
No! I've been abracadabbed into a fancy feasting second-rate sidekick!
Well, that's cool enough. I wonder what they're gonna do with that plot point. Oh, nothing? They just switch back at the end? Okay. Fiona teaches a bunch of Disney princesses that they can be badass. Well, that's fine, but it doesn't really connect to any sort of thematic through line that I can detect. Performance is emphasized throughout the film. King Arthur is a good actor, and Prince Charming, the antagonist of the movie, puts on a big play. And that could be really cool, especially because performance and masking has been a major idea in the Shrek series. But here, it amounts to nothing. I don't know what to think about it, it's just kinda there. And when I see all these random things that don't really come together or develop the characters at all, I can't help but feel like the film has nothing to say, and it knows it. At the beginning of Shrek 3, the state is an unquestioned good that the characters have to reproduce. At the end, the state is reproduced. Arthur becomes the king, and all is well. But between those two events happening, everything is incidental. Nobody questions who they are or what they're trying to protect, and the movie can't feel motivated. It can only show us arbitrary, disconnected images at this point. I think the most telling scene in Shrek 3 occurs right at the very end. See, there's all these fairy tale villains in the movie who conspire against the monarchy, and in the climax, Arthur says this.
A good friend of mine once told me that just because people treat you like a villain, or an ogre, or just some loser, it doesn't mean you are one. The thing that matters most is what you think of yourself. If there's something you really want, or someone you really want to be, then the only person standing in your way is you.
I don't think I've ever felt as betrayed by a movie as I did when I rewatched this scene, and for that reason, I think it's kind of unintentionally brilliant. Like, the first two Shreks are all about the idea that power does weird stuff, that it constructs deviant identities and pushes people into unnatural positions. Shrek wasn't an outcast because of anything he did, rather, it because he was forced into society and framed as an outsider. But this movie turns all that on its head. These fairy tale villains, outsiders like Shrek was, are the way they are because they made some bad choices. It has nothing to do with society or the state.
Then the only person standing in your way is you.
The current order of power is perfect, and if these characters want to redeem themselves, they have to uphold that power. With this in mind, let's move on to Shrek Forever After, the final movie to date in the Shrek series. A lot of people think the fourth movie is better than the third, and I don't know if I disagree with that, but I find it almost disgusting to watch. It's just so inexplicably dark. Like, there aren't a lot of jokes in it, and a lot of it takes place at night, and the villain straight up murders somebody for no reason. It's a lot, and I don't know why it had to be as much as it was, but at least they took a risk, I guess. Anyway, if Shrek 3 took the series in a bold new thematic direction, then Shrek Forever After takes a few little steps forward in that direction. At the beginning of the movie, Shrek is totally accepted by society, and the conflict now comes from him being somewhat unhappy as an insider. He's bored with his life and misses being an outcast, so he makes a deal with Rumpelstiltskin to get one day of pure ogre freedom. Because of that, the world turns to garbage. The royal family is killed, Rumpelstiltskin runs a terrible police state, Fiona was never saved from the tower, and Shrek has to turn everything normal again. So, what does this movie tell us? Well, it's simple, right? Once you're included in the state, just let it make you whatever it needs to make you. You don't feel like you're living authentically, you're unhappy being the person society thinks you should be? Suck it up and don't change anything. Life could get a lot worse. And where the antagonists of the first 3 movies were all fops, who were either in positions of power or who felt they had some hereditary claim to power, the antagonist in Shrek 4 is small and ambitious and creepy looking.
Tell me, how are you enjoying your day?
He's a deviant who needs to be stopped so we can return to the status quo. When we look at all 4 Shrek movies and try to see them as one cohesive narrative, what we get is kind of horrific. Over the course of the films, Shrek goes from being an outsider who rejects power to being power's unwitting and unthoughtful dupe. The state goes from being this alien entity that we can be critical of and fight against to being natural and unchangeable. At the end of Shrek Forever After, everything does go back to normal. Shrek is happier now with his life, but this time it's not because he found himself or anything like that. I mean, his domestic, stagnant life goes totally unchanged. No, the only thing Shrek realizes is that, all things considered, he lives in the best of all possible worlds. How sad is that? So, that's all I had to say about Shrek. I really enjoyed making this one, and I hope you liked watching it. And if you did, leave a comment that says, "Who dog it? Didn't know a video could make me this happy. Shrek, Shrek, Shrek. I have Shrek fever." And then just close it out with a dot, dot, dot. Okay, well, no Patreon question of the video this time around because I didn't get one again. So, I'll just see you later. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll Shrek you on the next Shrek